Happy Halloween, everybody! In honour of this spooky season, I thought I'd make a wee video about some scary movies. I know, talking about horror films right around Halloween. How do I come up with these unique and original ideas? Anyway, for this video, I decided to talk about some films that you might have overlooked in the past or been sceptical about for various reasons. Or maybe they've just never passed under your radar. But I like them, and I think some other people out there would like them too, so here we are. Am I recommending all of these films to everyone? No, because taste is a very personal thing. But after I've talked about each film, I think you'll have a better idea of whether or not these are for you. So, without further ado, here are 5 films that I think might be worth your time this Halloween. Much as it feels weird to even call The Exorcist a franchise, by this point it very much is. And it's a strange one at that. The first film was a cultural phenomenon. It got nominated for 10 Academy Awards, 2 of which it won, and is often hailed as the greatest horror film of all time. It's still up there with my all-time favourites, and I usually watch it about this time every year. As for the rest of the Exorcist series, let's just say that by this point there have been more misses than hits. Back in the 2000s, I bought Exorcist II: The Heretic on VHS for 99p in a Blockbuster, and I still feel cheated to this day. There were also not 1, but 2 different prequels made at roughly the same time, Exorcist the Beginning and Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. And from what I've heard, they're both pretty meh. And that's so disappointing to me because The Exorcist, and in particular the backstory of Father Lancaster Merrin, could have made for a truly excellent prequel. Then we had last year's Exorcist Believer, which was fucking dreadful by all accounts, so much so that plans for 2 proposed sequels have since been scrapped. I like to imagine that any notes for these cancelled projects have since been doused in holy water, stabbed with a crucifix, and tossed down a long, steep flight of stairs. As for Exorcist III, it's actually pretty great. This is, in a sense, the true sequel to the original novel and film as it was written and directed by the original author and producer William Peter Blatty. I say in a sense because Legion is still very much its own self-contained story, was never intended to be a straightforward follow-on, and really didn't have that much to do with exorcisms. But we'll get back to that part in a minute. Blatty had nothing to do with Exorcist II, and neither did Exorcist director William Friedkin, who described the sequel as the worst piece of crap he'd ever seen. It's just really unfortunate that the bad sequel came out first, while Legion spent years in development hell, and that a lot of people ignored this one purely because of the second film. Me included. Yeah, it was that bad. So let's just pretend that film doesn't exist, and let's talk about a more worthy successor. The story of Legion centres around 2 of the secondary characters from The Exorcist, namely Lieutenant Kinderman and Father Dyer. Neither of the actors reprised their roles here, as Lee J. Cobb passed away in 1976, and William O'Malley was probably busy with his day job of being a real-life Catholic priest. However, George C. Scott and Ed Flanders did an excellent job as the leads, plus we get some truly great performances from Brad Dourif and another actor I won't name, just in case you're familiar with the first film and I end up giving away spoilers. Taking us back to Georgetown, the story follows an investigation into a series of demonic murders that, Kinderman notes, share all the hallmarks of the Gemini Killer, who was inspired in part by the real-life Zodiac Killer, which is complicated as the Gemini Killer is already dead. Plus, somehow these events seem to link back to the incidents from 17 years earlier that took place in the wake of the exorcism of Regan McNeil. There really is a lot to love about this film, both as the official follow-up to The Exorcist, and just as a good, tense supernatural thriller. The film is well written and equally well directed, which is very impressive as this was only Blatty's second shot at directing. And he only took on that role due to creative differences with William Friedkin and later with John Carpenter, both of whom backed out of the project. But what can I say? Blatty must just have been a natural because the end result really is superb. Like The Exorcist, it stands up as a great film just in general, while also having some really gripping moments and some great scares, with one in particular that has an incredible build-up and remains one of the scariest moments I've encountered in years. Trust me, you'll know when you see it. Now, if you're an Exorcist fan or you just enjoy the creative process of making films, I would definitely recommend the Arrow Films edition, which was very reasonably priced the last time I checked. I say this because the Blu-ray contains both the theatrical cut and the reassembled director's cut of the film. The theatrical cut is very good, don't get me wrong, but there was a hefty amount of studio interference before the film was released, and frankly, it shows. There are scenes with one character that feel tacked on, because they very much were, and this ends up drastically affecting the third act. It's not bad, but it just doesn't quite fit the tone of the rest of the film. The director's cut, while patched together with a lot of grainy, poor quality footage, shows the story this should have been. And I will say that both versions would be worthy of your time. I watched the theatrical cut, then the director's cut, and I'd already read the novel before then, which also gets my seal of approval, by the way. Plus, I'd also add that you don't have to have seen The Exorcist to appreciate Legion, as it stands up pretty well in its own right. Side note, this film apparently has a VR game on Steam that I wasn't aware of until writing this, and will probably never play as VR and motion sickness are a bad combination. Trust me, after 5 minutes of this I could probably give those vomiting scenes from the original movie a run for their money. But that's yet another weird little thing to add to the Exorcist franchise. One last thing, and I'd advise you to skip to the next part or close your eyes if you've never seen The Exorcist, but this synopsis I found on Amazon Prime has to be one of the worst I've ever seen. I mean, just look at it. This was especially painful for me as I used to write and edit plot synopses as part of my job, and I've no idea how something this bad for a film of this stature even came to be. I'm still struggling to decide if this is down to AI or human incompetence. I just don't know. If anyone out there has ever seen a worse horror synopsis or could come up with a worse one for The Exorcist, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And so we go from one classic horror film that probably didn't even need a sequel to another one. At this point, The Shining needs no introduction, and it's up there with The Exorcist in terms of prestige must-watch horror. But rather than let the studio churn out The Shining 2 Electric Boogaloo, Stephen King had legitimate and compelling reasons to explore the life of the adult Dan Torrance and to revisit the supernatural-infused world he'd created for the original story. The film Dr. Sleep works as both a faithful adaptation of the Stephen King novel of the same name and also as a direct sequel to the Stanley Kubrick version of The Shining. And that statement might confuse and surprise some listeners. If you're familiar with King's opinions on the Kubrick film and how it deviated from the source material, you'll know that this was a nigh-on impossible task. Because by the end of the novel and the film, different characters were left alive or dead, plus we might have ended up with a very different view of some of those characters. Hell, even the key location of the Overlook Hotel was left in a radically different state by the end depending on which story you heard. King's hatred for the Kubrick film was legendary, even if his opinion eventually softened, and King even went as far as to create his own 100% faithful TV adaptation in 1997, which was, unfortunately, the first version of The Shining I ever saw. Don't watch it, it's crap. So there was director Mike Flanagan trying to marry up the two radically different takes on the story in one fell swoop. And that name got my interest right away. Even before The Haunting of Hill House, which really showcased his skills at depicting generational trauma and psychological horror, I'd already been won over by his earlier films Oculus and Hush. Hush, by the way, is another horror I'd definitely recommend, which places a deaf-mute character in a remote home invasion scenario, making for an incredibly tense and neat 81 minutes. I think it's on Shudder right now if you have that. As for Oculus, a film centred on a family drama and a possibly haunted mirror, I did a whole video analysing the film several years ago. I called it Oculus Cracking the Mirror, and I'm still really pleased with that title, by the way. Once you're familiar with that particular prop, known as the laser glass, it won't be long before you start spotting it in Mike Flanagan's other works. It's a neat little piece of continuity, kinda like the hair statue from Inside Number 9. Anyway, Dr. Sleep tells the story of the adult Danny Torrance, the kid from the original Shining, and how things worked out for him after his ordeal at the Overlook Hotel. Not so great, as it happens, which is understandable given his traumatic childhood, the fact that he's still being literally haunted thanks to his supernatural talents, and, as a result, Dan is now struggling with alcoholism just like his old man. The story also expands the Shining universe as we meet other characters with their own Shining abilities, and a group of psychic vampires who prey upon them, led by Rebecca Ferguson as Rose the Hat. Rose's questionable Irish accent aside, she's an excellent villain and just so damn entertaining to watch. Likewise, Ewan McGregor was perfectly cast as Dan Torrance and really gets across that despite his hardships and questionable life choices, this is someone who's really struggling to be a good person and to do the right thing. Kylie Curran also gives a great performance here, showing a lot of wisdom and maturity for her young age. Now, maybe other people's tastes will vary here, but I loved every minute of Dr. Sleep. And I say that both as someone who enjoyed the book and also someone who is a big fan of the Kubrick film. A tough act to follow on both fronts. A lot of the content from the books is brought to life here, even some ideas from the original Shining that never made it to the Kubrick version, but for me it never went too far in over-explaining its plot, characters or lore. And if you haven't read either of the books, I would still recommend this film. I watched it in the cinema with someone who hadn't read Dr. Sleep, and even while I was engrossed, I couldn't help but worrying that he was getting lost in all the references that weren't being explained, or bored by the film's slow pace and long run time. Put it this way, you could almost watch Hush twice in the same time it takes to watch Dr. Sleep once. However, I have been reassured by him and by others who went in blind that this was not the case, and the film was just as engaging for them as it was for me. As for the horror factor, there's still plenty of that in there, both psychological and supernatural. There's a very strong addiction and recovery story going on, and you can tell Stephen King drew a lot from his own experience. You've got Dan's visions and repressed memories, leading to some very frightening moments, as well as the threat of Rose and her posse. There is one scene in particular that really shocked me, even though I knew it was coming. Just so you know, hopefully without spoiling too much, the scene I'm talking about involves the torture and murder of a child. Because wow, that kid could scream. I know I'm not the only one who's freaked out by this part, so just a heads up if that's something you're particularly sensitive to. If you were on the fence with this one, either because you never saw The Shining or because you thought it was a perfect film that didn't need a sequel, I would say don't let that put you off. I agree, it didn't need a sequel, but the story they end up telling easily stands up on its own 2 feet. And while it certainly pays homage to Kubrick's film, with various references and recreations of his style, it's all done tastefully and never to the point of overkill. It's not relying on you to recognise bits of The Shining just to get any value from it. From what I've heard, Warner Brothers left that duty to Ready Player One, and the film is very respectful to all of its source material, which I think helped with the sense of cohesion and continuity. In short, Dr. Sleep is a great film whether or not you've seen The Shining. And if you haven't seen The Shining, then yes, obviously I'm going to recommend that you see that too, but you didn't need me to tell you that. As for the book, I'd highly recommend reading Dr. Sleep, even if you've already seen the film. They have two very different endings, but to me they were equally satisfying. At the time of recording this, Dr. Sleep is available on Amazon Prime for US viewers and also to rent or buy on a few other platforms. I'll leave a link below. Though this is another one I was more than happy to buy on Blu-ray. It's a great looking film and it sets me up nicely for a shining double bill. Okay, so this one I'm not even sure is a recommendation at all because the film seems to be absolutely polarising. But I watched it, it's in my head now, and I have to talk about it. People who've watched Skinamarink will either call it creative, mesmeric and profoundly terrifying, or they'll say it's pretentious, overly long and a complete waste of time. But hey, I'm someone who is notoriously awkward when it comes to things you're supposed to love or hate with no middle ground, and personally I think Marmite is okay some of the time. So here's what I took from the film, and hopefully this will let you know if it's right for you. Skinamarink is the first feature-length film by the experimental Canadian filmmaker Kyle Edward Ball. Ball also runs the YouTube channel Bite-Sized Nightmares, which mostly consists of short films based on ideas suggested by commenters, often drawing from nightmares of their own. The channel's description reads "Best watched with the lights off and headphones on," and I must say these videos are highly atmospheric, with an odd sense of time and place that feels undefined but also weirdly nostalgic. The films are disorienting, filled with dark and abstract shots, and give the impression that it's been played back on tape that has been stretched and warped to within an inch of its life. Skinamarink expands this nightmare concept to a full-length feature, in which two very young children find themselves alone in the house at night. Unexplained events, sights and sounds are happening all around them, and the windows and doors of the house keep gradually disappearing. While watching, you're drawn into that childlike sense of fear, dread and helplessness during a long night where all you can do is wait for the morning to come and for things to turn back to normal. If they ever do. Like the short films, Skinamarink is highly abstract, massively distorted and usually unclear about what is happening. It's less telling you a story and more tapping into a primal sense of danger through your own faded memories. This is not the kind of film that holds your hand or really explains itself at all. There aren't many characters, the ones we do have are rarely shown in full, and there is very little in the way of dialogue. What is there is often barely audible, and while some scenes are given subtitles, many of them aren't, and we're left unsure about what we're hearing, what we're looking at, and even why we're hearing or looking at it. The film plays with the concepts of liminal spaces and analogue horror. I don't know if it was just me, because I'm old, but something about the tape quality, the design of the house, and even the style of the children's toys did take me back and kinda made me feel like a child again myself. I also loved how so many of the scenes were lit only by a glowing TV somewhere in the room. Even some of the cartoons that they were playing were ones I was very familiar with, and I would say some interesting choices in there. That spider from the Cobweb Hotel always gave me the creeps, and the film Somewhere in Dreamland felt weirdly subversive here, as that was about two children escaping to a happy place through their dreams, while the two kids in the film appear to be trapped in a nightmare. So it kind of felt like a distorted, almost uncanny feeling of my own childhood memories, and the idea of feeling alone and unsafe at night. There's a sense of comfort and homeliness, but something's not quite right. Maybe I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this, but it's like you know there's a false sense of security, and that it could be ripped away from you at any moment. Was it scary? For me, yes, it was. In fact, there were parts where I was watching it from behind my fingers. Some of it came from the lingering dread as the feeling of being trapped grew even stronger. I also felt genuinely terrified as the film switched to the perspective of the children, and an unsettling voice compelled them to do things you really didn't want them to do. Even something as simple as being told to look under the bed gave me that sense of panic. Also, there were a few jump scares that really frightened me and my dog, but I felt those were done effectively and they weren't overused. Also, I have to give credit here, any film that can scare me shitless using one of those kiddie toy telephones deserves a mention. So, is this film for you? To be honest, I didn't even know if it was a film for me. In fact, I wasn't even sure if I was going to stick with it even when I was already half an hour in. The pace is extremely slow and for a long time, not much seems to be happening. And yes, I understood that the film was building atmosphere, but even now I'm not sure it really needed to be built up for quite that long. But at the same time, I wouldn't advise skipping parts of it or doing something else while the first half is playing. I watched it alone at night, which does feel like the best way to view this film. Of course, if you're still unsure, the best thing to do would be to check out Bite-Sized Nightmares and see if that does anything for you. I've heard it said that whether or not you'll get much out of Skinamarink depends on whether or not you were afraid of the dark as a child. I think that's pretty fair, although I would expand on that just a little. I wasn't afraid of the dark, but sometimes I would be anxious about going to sleep. Sometimes my imagination would run riot, producing horrible nightmares, and sometimes I'd get false awakenings from those nightmares, only to be scared again when I least expected it. Often I'd be too afraid to go back to sleep, too anxious to get up in case I was still dreaming and got taken by surprise again, so I'd take comfort in having the TV on at night. If any of this sounds familiar, then maybe this is something you would appreciate as well. The other interesting thing about the film is the discourse and the theories that have emerged from those who've watched it. Things are left very much down to interpretation, and some of those interpretations are really fascinating to explore. In fact, you might even find the discussion part more rewarding than the film itself. Many moons ago, this was exactly how I felt about the Blair Witch Project, a film I respected but personally didn't get an awful lot from, but the discourse around it was really something else. So maybe that's reason enough for you to watch it. Well, I've just explained Skinamarink as well as I possibly can in terms of a recommendation. Either you'll be drawn into the experimental style before experiencing sheer terror, or you might spend an hour and 40 minutes being bored out of your skull. Or maybe you'll see it, appreciate what it was trying to do, then head straight to the internet to read other people's interpretations and share your own. I don't know, but I'd be curious to hear your own experiences in the comments. It's on Shudder at the time of me writing this, by the way, if you have access to that. Now, here's one that really surprised me and even goes against my usual opinions on mixing horror with social media or watching scary movies on a laptop. Normally I'd say, don't do it. Put it on the big telly, turn the lights off, and yeet your devices out of reach for the duration. Light some candles too if you're feeling fancy. I don't know, I just get so tired of people saying that film was crap and it wasn't scary, when their only experience was playing it on a laptop with a bunch of other tabs open while also scrolling their phone. Probably not the movie's fault that you weren't really engaged with it. So, as you can imagine, I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that I actually enjoyed Unfriended, because everything I knew about it would have indicated otherwise. I'm not normally that big on teen horrors, slashers or whatever, as it often feels like you're just sitting around waiting for the next one to die. Movies using Skype, group chats and other social media tools wouldn't normally interest me either, as these things tend to feel more like a chore in real life, for I am an antisocial bastard. Even the title, Unfriended, sounded asinine to me at first, though I do admit there can be a surprising amount of emotional weight involved in the process of removing a contact, especially if that's someone you were once close to. Anyway, in case you didn't know, Unfriended is a horror film made in the screen life format, as in the entire action takes place through a computer, tablet or smartphone. This was actually one of the main films that helped to popularise this method, which has since been used to tell stories in other genres as well, such as drama and comedy. However, screen life really feels at home with horror to me, given its similarities to other techniques such as found footage. All of the action takes place with the main characters on a group Skype call, with different apps, tabs and notifications opening up on the same screen. There you go, that's the gimmick. And it's interesting just how engrossing this can be, as you notice small details and wait to see whether or not the people involved will react to them and how. Before long, the chat starts being intruded upon by an unknown user. The group makes various attempts to get rid of them, but to no avail. Once the connection is made between this mystery account and a former friend and classmate who took their own life, tensions mount as the group is unsure what it is they're dealing with. Not long after this, they also begin to doubt whether or not they can even trust each other. What I really loved was how quickly the anxiety ramped up and how trapped I felt as a viewer, which really helped me to empathise with the characters and their predicament. Because you just can't look away. You can't switch off because they can't switch off, or something terrible might happen. You're just there, staring at the screen, dreading what's going to happen next. And as much as the group begins turning on each other, there's still safety in numbers and no one wants to log off and be left alone and vulnerable. The editing and performances here are also very impressive, and they made it look so seamless. Recordings were made using some very long takes for a film, including several 10-minute shots, as well as a full 80-minute take that each actor did from a separate room using an actual computer. And in the final edit, the whole thing feels really authentic, I have to say. Well, they're not all talking over each other like people might do in a real group chat, but frankly that's something I could do without anyway. The editing with the screens too is expertly done, and while I thought this might be distracting, they really know how to subtly draw your attention where it needs to be visually, while the audio from the actors carries on in the background. I don't know how they managed it, but they did. Not only am I surprised that this worked and actually managed to hold my attention while building up the story, I'm even more impressed after seeing some other films that tried to adopt a similar technique and either fell flat or quickly became unwatchable for me. Simply putting distortion on a video call and scrambling some of the sounds and pictures purely because that's what happens in real life only makes for a frustrating experience, at least for me. Even worse if I'm not engaged in the story or characters yet, and I'm struggling against the poor reception, I'm probably not going to stick around with it very long. Unfriended used this technique too, but it used it sparingly and to greater effect, and usually when things were becoming more chaotic off-screen. The technical elements helped reflect that, which I think was very clever. The other thing that stood out to me was the way the film explored the idea of cyberbullying. As someone who was bullied, but back before the technology was really there, that sounds absolutely horrific. The fact that a young person might have no respite from their tormentors, even when they're at home and away from school, sounds like the worst kind of horror imaginable. Also, the idea that the mistakes you make might never go away once they're published on the internet, or that total strangers may join in harassing you. Honestly, I can't even imagine what it feels like to suffer like that. If that's happened to you, then I am so sorry, and I hope things got better for you, and also, this film might be a bit of a hard watch. But then again, if you take this as more of a revenge story on behalf of the character who'd been cyberbullied, maybe it'll be cathartic for you. But either way, I'd proceed with caution. The fact that this is a serious topic being explored in a horror film with some possible supernatural elements might sound to some like it's just sensationalising or cheapening other people's trauma. But that just wasn't the case here. In fact, I think supernatural or psychological horror can be a great way to make sense of our real fears and anxieties. Plus, the handling of the theme didn't feel super moralising or heavy-handed in the way that a straight drama on the subject might have been. To take the idea of people being haunted by their mistakes, then making the jump to having that happen literally, was a great idea in my opinion. And it's a great idea that was brilliantly executed. Oh, and speaking of executed, there are some creative and rather gory deaths in this film. So, while it does deal with some heavy subjects, Unfriended is also a good time if you're into some good killings. While I'm not sure if this is available for free on any streaming services at present, Unfriended is available to rent or buy across a wide range of channels from Universal Pictures Home Entertainment. You can even get it right here on YouTube. If this sounded at all good, then it's definitely worth 80 minutes of your time, and I'm sure it'll work great played on just about any device. Okay, so this last one was a film I saw in the cinema a few years back after a bad day and expected nothing much in particular, just something to watch to take our minds off things. Since then, it's become not just a favourite Halloween movie at my place, but also a favourite anytime movie and has a place of honour on the little shelf under the TV ready to play at any time. So, Ready or Not is a sort of dark comedy horror slasher which takes place in the evening of a wedding at a rich family's house. Said rich family invites the bride to play a randomly selected game as part of a silly, light-hearted initiation activity. After she pulls out the card for hide and seek, the game turns out to be anything but. See, the family fortune didn't come from nowhere, and whether or not it's actually true, the family firmly believes in a devilish pact made generations ago that must be honoured to the letter. And in this house, hide and seek is a game played to the death. Unbeknownst to the bride, she's about to be hunted down until the morning when, in all honesty, nobody seems to be quite sure what's supposed to happen. And that's it. This is a great black comedy script, perfectly plotted and with some hysterically placed and delivered lines. There are plenty of colourful characters, led by Samara Weaving, who I've enjoyed in just about everything I've ever seen her in. She plays Grace, who's the bride, and one of the few sympathetic characters in this whole malarkey. Grace, along with her lovely wedding dress, goes through quite the transformation over the course of the film. Some great how it started versus how it's going shots from her married life, and it's only her wedding night. Aside from a few exceptions, the rest of the family go the whole hog to hunt a human being to their death, grabbing their weapons and getting straight down to business. It's a rogues gallery of drug addicts, drunks and snobs who wouldn't think twice about enlisting the help in their murder spree or accidentally hitting a few of them in the crossfire. And yes, most of these characters are privileged morons bumbling about with muskets and crossbows they barely know how to handle. But the fact that they're all basically insane and are happy to bend the rules to suit themselves still makes them pretty intimidating. As I might have said before about the Inside Number 9 episode Sardines, another story with a dark twist featuring the game that's kind of the opposite to hide and seek. I don't want to generalise, but rich people are all freaks and you shouldn't play games with them. I won't spoil what happens, but I will say the ending is amazing, and the entire finale, including the last scene, had me in hysterics. And in all the times I've watched it, I've never thought that wasn't an hour and a half well spent. You can find Ready or Not on Disney Plus at the moment, or you could probably pick up a DVD copy fairly cheap. As I said, it's a great film to have on hand at any time. So, those were 5 films I think might be worth your time this Halloween. Hopefully at least one of them has piqued your interest, and I might have helped you discover something new. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video. Also, if you'd like to hear some more in-depth discussions on some different films, which are ones I absolutely would recommend, why not have a look at my video essays on horror playlist? Because, come on, there's got to be something in there. And if you're new here, I also talk a lot about the anthology series Inside Number 9, which has some great Halloweeny episodes, including The Harrowing, which I talked about just recently, and Deadline, which was their live Halloween special that maybe didn't go quite to plan. You can find both of those videos and more linked below. Once again, thanks so much for watching this video. Why not give it a like if you liked it, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and if you really enjoy what I'm doing, why not check out my Patreon? Scrolling past are the names of all my lovely patrons who get to ask me questions and see these videos a little bit early. Thanks so much to all you guys, you're the best. Okay, I'm off to watch something spooky, don't know quite what yet, and I'd like to wish you all a very happy Halloween. Bye for now.